really important kind of framing activity. Look at some of the general principles of witness testimonies, including some good practice and some of the kind of common mistakes that we see that you can avoid if you're aware of them. A bit of a focus towards the end on audio recorded witness testimonies, because we're starting to see more of them actually, particularly over the last sort of 6 or 7 months. And then really a summary and an opportunity for Q&A at the end. So again, there's probably about half an hour's worth of me talking, sorry, and then plenty of time at the end for questions, though, if you've got any. So why have we decided to focus on witness testimonies, and why now? Well, as I said, I mean, over the last sort of 6 months or so, we've definitely seen an increase in the number of witness testimonies that are submitted as part of portfolios of evidence. And some key reasons for that, really, I think COVID has really, put the boosters on witness testimonies in particular for a couple of reasons. I think the first is that apprentices have had difficulties in obtaining some of the kind of work-based product evidence that they traditionally put in their portfolios. And that might be because they've been furloughed and they're kind of continuing with their apprenticeship training from home. In a lot of instances, they actually haven't been furloughed. They're still working, but actually because they're no longer in the office, they don't have access to all of that evidence anymore. And so what they're doing is they're using things like witness testimonies really to kind of validate and authenticate some of the other kind of reflective statements and observations and things that are in their portfolio. Forgive me, I'll just pause for 1 second. I'm just keeping an eye on the chat function just to make sure there aren't any kind of questions or challenges or anything people are having while we go through. Okay. Yeah, so the other thing is, so we've had apprentices who maybe had difficulty in getting the product evidence for furlough or because they're working from home, but also obviously the EQAP, so that might be the Institute for Apprenticeships, it might be Ofqual, have introduced flexibilities, and customer service is a really good example where they've actually allowed witness testimonies to form an assessment method in and of themselves. So they've replaced one of the other assessment methods within the portfolio, within the EPA. So customer service is an excellent example. We've just been approved by Ofqual to deliver EPA for customer service practitioner. And they wrote to us and said, okay, we're allowing the following flexibilities for apprentices who are no longer kind of in the workplace but are continuing their studies. A customer service practitioner normally has an observation in there where the assessor will go to the workplace and they'll observe them for a period of time. Obviously, that can't happen at the moment. Nobody wants those apprentices to kind of suffer. We need them to be able to continue with their studies for a variety of different reasons. So the flexibility there is that observation as a temporary measure can be replaced by a witness testimony, which is followed by a Q&A session. And I think one thing that we've recognized as an organization is that with witness testimonies in particular, I guess one of the weaknesses of them is that the employers often don't fully understand what the purpose of a witness testimony is. So they'll might give a really glowing, warm account of the apprentice, but actually it doesn't tick the boxes that we needed to tick. So if we're using a witness testimony for customer service, for example, we need to make sure, because it's going to be such a substantial part of the EPA, that we give those employers as much guidance as we possibly can so that they get it right first time. So really, I mean, that combination of different factors lent us to feel that this would be the really good time for us to focus on witness testimonies in particular. We have seen a variation actually in terms of the approach taken to completing witness testimonies, but then also in terms of the quality. And it's difficult to identify trends, to be honest. You might think there'd be trends, but actually we'll have maybe a training provider and even an individual coach who one day submits a portfolio with an exceptional witness testimony in it, and we get one a week later and it's not so good. What we can't really do is share with you specific examples today, because obviously they have quite sensitive kind of information in them, commercial information and stuff like that. But what we have done is reached out to the assessors and IQAs that we work with to ask them to highlight the examples of good practice and also poor practice as well, so it can pick out the key themes, I guess, and trends, and then share them with you. Okay. The other reason really is that we're getting more and more requests from training providers for guidance, which is understandable. If you guys are using them more, then you're going to need more guidance as to what good looks like. We have seen some really good examples and want to share with you now what some of those are really. So I mentioned, I think a good framing activity is exploring the use of, and purpose of a witness testimony. And I think that this is really important, even if you yourselves are kind of comfortable and familiar with the concept and what the purpose of it is. I'll reiterate that the employers often aren't, and they might think of it as just, okay, well, I'm going to write a really nice account of this person, but actually if it's not aligned to the learning outcomes, if it's not specific, then it can't really be used and it doesn't contribute towards the assessment. So we've categorized it really as having three key uses, if you like, three key purposes. So the first one is that it validates the evidence. So call it what you will, validation, authentication, corroboration. It validates effectively the rest of the evidence in that portfolio, and in particular, the reflective statements. We get some really good written statements from apprentices around kind of work that they've done, and then there's some product evidence in there that backs it up. And what the witness testimony can do is, particularly if you've got a witness testimony which is written to align to a particular reflective statement, it helps to validate that activity, that it actually took place, and that the apprentice's account is an accurate one. I think the scenario described before, under the current circumstances with COVID, a lot of apprentices are struggling to get the product evidence, but actually, even under normal circumstances, financial services in particular, we do a lot of work in. Quite often, evidence will be heavily redacted because it's very sort of commercially sensitive stuff that naturally employers are not keen on sharing with anybody. So in those types of instances, witness testimonies, although they can't be used kind of exclusively as a form of validation, they're really good at fortifying those accounts and satisfying the independent assessor that that account is true and accurate. So validation, number one. Number two, really important one, easy to overlook, is that it provides that additional perspective for the endpoint assessor. So it helps them to form a more holistic view, but also a more objective view. An apprentice's kind of own reflective account is almost by design and definition going to be subjective because it's their own view of themselves. Having somebody else's view or other people's views within the workplace is really important, because it also helps the assessor to kind of come up with questions and areas that they want to probe, either in the interview or in the professional discussion, if one follows the portfolio, which it usually does. And the third is that it can actually complement and enhance the portfolio of evidence as well. So it's not just about validating that it actually happened. It can actually improve upon the evidence. So for example, if an apprentice has put in there a reflective statement, but there are additional things that the apprentice did that their line manager might have noticed, but the apprentice isn't aware that they've done it, then they can put that in there. So it can actually fortify and strengthen the evidence that's in the portfolio, potentially getting them from a pass to a distinction, particularly if, for example, it's aligned to kind of behaviors. So if the line manager's observed it and they said, well, actually, it was a really difficult, and people normally struggle under those circumstances, but the apprentice handled it really well, with that specificity as to how and why they handled it well, that can actually help to strengthen the evidence that's already in the portfolio. Okay, so next, before we look at some of the specific kind of good and bad examples, if you like, we just wanted to look at some of the general principles around witness testimonies. What it is really is it is a written or an audio recorded account of specific observed activities. And we use that word specific because, again, we need to reiterate that it's not kind of general terms. We get a lot of witness testimonies that actually read really well, but they're so general, they're just saying, such and such is, they've really grown in confidence and they're well respected and, they're the highest performing member of the team. But how do you justify that? How do you quantify that? At the end of the day, this is feeding into an assessment against specified learning outcomes. So it needs to align to those learning outcomes, and it needs to be specific around actual activities and not kind of just general things. It's often described as being the same really as an observation, but it's done kind of after the event rather than somebody there with a sort of checklist making notes as the person's kind of undergoing the activity. Now, it's typically the line manager that does the witness testimony, but it doesn't have to be. Quite often we'll see really good witness testimonies from peers or other people kind of across the organization. and even subordinates. And I hate that term, but the thesaurus didn't throw up a suitable alternative, so I've had to use it. But by that we mean really, for example, if it's a team leader apprenticeship, and there's a witness testimony in there around kind of the effectiveness of coaching, for example, it might be a coachee, so it might be somebody that the line manager's coached, and it might be their account of, okay, well, this is where I was when I started, this is how they supported me and encouraged me and developed me. So actually, it doesn't have to just be the line manager that submits a witness testimony. It can be from a variety of kind of different people within the organization. Again, it needs to be aligned to specific KSBs or ideally learning outcomes. At the end of the day, yes, we use holistic assessment. No, it's not a framework, it's the apprenticeship standard, but the assessor has a list of learning outcomes that have been predefined by the Trailblazer group that are in the assessment plan. So they simply have to be satisfied that they've seen competence against those learning outcomes. So aligning those witness testimony activities to those specific learning outcomes is only going to help the apprentice, really. This applies in general across the board, actually, but I think in particular with something like a witness testimony, that I should have said at the start that this webinar really is designed primarily for coaches supporting apprentices and working with employers. And that relationship between the coach and the line manager is absolutely critical, particularly with the witness testimony, because of those reasons we gave before, that the employers often don't fully understand what the purpose or the desired outcome of the activity actually is. It's really important to get it right first time, because if you go to an employer and they invest a bunch of time in writing a witness testimony or doing some recordings, and then you subsequently find out it wasn't any use because it was too generic, for example, it's a difficult conversation to go back to that employer and say that they have to do it again. So it's important to get it right first time, and also to kind of learn. And each time you do it, run it through your internal IQA processes, get that feedback, and kind of improve it iteration by iteration. It's really important that witness testimonies are effectively mapped. And I say effectively because we don't necessarily dictate how the mapping should look, but it needs to be sufficiently detailed and granular that the assessor can pinpoint the evidence. So if it's an audio recording, for example, we'd expect it to be time-stamped, particularly if it's a longer recording. If it's a written witness testimony, and if it's sort of 5 or 6 pages long, it's really useful somewhere in the document to indicate where in the witness testimony each of the individual learning outcomes has been met. It just helps the assessor, and actually it frees up the assessor's time and cognitive capacity, if you like, to be focusing on things like holistic assessment as well. It's not really the job of the assessor to be hunting for evidence. It should be signposted to them. However, if they do see additional bits of evidence that weren't signposted and weren't mapped, they will award the marks for it, and they will make a record of that in the feedback sheet. And I've just put a quote in there just to give a bit of context, really, and justification as to what I've said and why I've said it. And that's from the newly published Team Leader Standard, which came out at the end of last month. And in particular, when it talks about witness testimonies, an example, their description is: any employer contribution should focus only on direct observation of evidence rather than opinions. And that's a theme that we'll come back to. And it ties into what I was saying before. It's all very well having a witness testimony saying we think this person's the bee's knees, they're the best person that's ever done that job. If that's not quantifiable and that's not aligned to the assessment outcomes, it can't be assessed. So it's pretty much useless, to be honest. It's a really important statement then. It's a really important thing to always bear in mind. That said, I do think there is value in having the employer's opinion in there. It's not necessarily going to directly affect the outcome of the assessment, but I think it's important that if they think they're the best person that's ever done the job, that they have the opportunity to say that, because that's going to help form the assessor's kind of holistic view, and it's going to help them identify what sort of questions they might ask again in the presentation and the interview.
Jake,
Yep.
Just got a few questions coming in now, so I'm going to read out a couple if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
So Claire's asked, does the witness testimony for customer service apply to both practitioner and specialist?
I don't know is the honest answer to that, because we're currently only approved for the practitioner. We're putting an application in for the specialist. I would imagine it would be the same, because they follow the same principles. It's the same sort of occupation, just at a different level. I can find that out though, definitely, and get back to you.
Great. That also answers Sue's question, because Sue is asking about have we got approval for specialist? So that's one we're going for. Do we have an approximate timeline on that, Jake?
I daresn't give one.
Yeah, put you on the spot there, sorry.
I'll follow up on that, but yeah, I'm not going to give one now because I'll get in trouble with.
Okay. All right. Another question is, can the skills coach write a witness testimony?
Really good question. I can't see why not. Generally, skills coaches would do observations in my experience, but I don't really see why not. No.
Okay, great, thanks. Another one from Sarah. So she's asked, the witness testimony doesn't have to be from somebody that's a grade above the learner. Yeah,
good question. So if you, going back to the customer service example, it actually does, but only because that's specified by Ofqual, that it needs to be somebody a grade above the apprentice. It depends really on the nature and the purpose of the witness testimony, I would say. So if it's somebody declaring the apprentice's competence around kind of the technical aspects of their role, then it would need to be somebody who's kind of suitably qualified themselves, because obviously if you had somebody else who's kind of just learning still, they're not competent to say, well, they know those technical parts of their role. So, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be the line manager that does the witness testimony. But if it's some of the softer skills or some of the behaviors, then it's perfectly acceptable for it to be their peers. So, if it's around inclusivity, for example, it might be that they've worked in a working group where they've had quieter members of the team within that group. Their line manager hasn't kind of observed or witnessed that activity, but other people within that group have. I think it would be unfair on the apprentice to discount those accounts. Obviously, you wouldn't want it exclusively to be made up of kind of accounts from peers and stuff, because naturally there's always more gravitas, I guess, to a witness statement from somebody that's got more kind of skin in the game or more to lose, which sounds like a really crude way of putting it, but I think there's an element of truth in that. So if the more senior the person is, kind of the more weight that their testimony has. But absolutely there'll be peers and even people who the apprentice might line manage themselves who can provide perfectly valid witness testimonies.
Okay, good. That actually leads into the next question a little bit. So how long does the witness have to have needed, how long should the witness have worked with the learner?
Good question, and it is something that's in kind of the DSW template and is usually included in templates, is that you would declare how long you've known the learner for. I don't think that there's any definite rule there, to be honest. And again, it kind of relates back to the purpose of and the context of the witness testimony. So if it were a case of, well, a witness testimony from somebody who said, okay, I joined the company, I was really nervous, I didn't really feel like I fitted in, this person really helped me and they coached me and they mentored me, well, that person might have only worked in the business for 6 months. So we wouldn't discount it, because again, it's really valid under the circumstances. So there isn't really a hard and fast rule, not one that we would apply anyway.
Good, yeah. And that you mentioned a template there. So in our toolkit, do we provide a witness testimony template? That's what Sandra's asked.
Yeah, so every single toolkit has an assessment template in there. What we are actually looking at the moment is creating, looking at the potential of, and we're really interested in people's kind of thoughts and feedback on this. After we created the template for the customer service COVID version, we started to explore, well, actually, would that be useful to have that sort of format within everything? So within the customer service practitioner, we've done 2 versions because Ofqual asked us to. So they said that the ATP, the training provider, would have to have the opportunity of either doing kind of, one big witness testimony that covered everything, or having smaller witness testimonies that covered each of the individual competency areas. So we've laid it out in 2 different formats. So one of them is where we'll have kind of an area for them to write in the witness testimony, but then also at the bottom a checklist of all of the individual learning outcomes. And I actually think that that kind of works. And the reason that we put that in was because with the customer service one, they've got to hit all those outcomes. They've got to in order to pass that particular method. So we know that even with kind of smaller witness testimonies, quite often if it's not aligned to the outcome, they'll fail, or they won't have met that outcome. But if the witness testimony is supposed to be assessing 20 outcomes and you've got to meet them all, it's really, really, really important that the employer has a really clear sight of those. So putting them in the same document and asking them to sort of self-declare almost, I think will help with that. So it's a really sort of, you know, almost over the top approach, but I wonder whether or not it would work with others. So if we created a bespoke template for each individual standard that, you know, it had the space for them to put in all of the generic details and who you are and how long you've known the apprentice, had the space for them to put in their description of what happened, then kind of where linking the learning outcomes throughout, and then also has that checklist at the bottom just so that the employer can tick off. Because I think it can also help the employer if they've got those learning outcomes before, or if they've got them while they're writing it, to almost align what they're writing and what they're saying so that it meets the outcome. The better the employer understands the outcome and the detail of the outcome, the more effective that witness testimony is going to be, definitely.
Okay, thanks. We've got a few more questions coming through. Do you want? How do you feel? Do you want them now, or do you want to?
I'll crack on just because it's past and
Yeah.
I've done my usual thing of saying I'll take half an hour and then waffling on for ages. So I'll crack on just so we get to the end, and then we'll take the rest of the questions then, if that's okay. Okay, so good practice. This is just the most important thing, is specificity is everything. All of the things that we've just said. Don't talk about generic things. Don't just express opinions. Express facts that are based on specific things that you've observed. That's the key bit of guidance that you can give to any witness. And the 5WH approach is just foolproof. It might seem, you know, a little bit sort of simplistic or crude even, but it works. And I think if the employer or the witness is asking themselves these questions before and while they're writing it, and if they review it afterwards and ask these questions, if they're doing all of these things, it will become a more effective exercise and it will contribute towards the assessment and the final grade. So the key questions really: who was involved in the activity, and in particular kind of if the apprentice was involved with other teams, were they involved with customers, were they involved with other external regulators or stakeholders. If they were involved in a team activity, it's really important that they're specific as to what their individual contribution was to that activity, rather than talking about what the group did or what the group achieved. Explaining what was the challenge or the problem or the opportunity that led to the activity, I think is good just in terms of setting the scene for the assessor. What rules, regulations, processes and systems did the apprentice follow is really important, because actually if pretty much every single standard has bits in it around following processes, external regulations, you know, escalations and things like that. Every single standard pretty much has that in. So if the employer's writing that in, and being specific as to which rules were followed and things like that, that's going to help the apprentice. Being specific about what took place. So what did you actually observe yourself as a witness? And what was the outcome of that activity? So was it successful? Did it lead on to anything else? Where did the activity take place, and when? It kind of tied in with each other. So was it just a one activity on a single day, or was it actually, you know, are you describing a larger kind of project or a complaint that they dealt with that took place over a period of time? That specificity is really important so that the assessor kind of gets a picture of it and understands it. But also the assessor needs to confirm that the activity took place within the acceptable time period. So you'll be aware that different standards will have different rules around when the evidence for the portfolio can kind of be gathered. So some of them will say, well, it can only be based on work that you've done post-gateway, for example. So the assessor needs to know when the activity actually took place, if nothing else, just to validate that it's acceptable. Sometimes we'll even get witness statements which are about stuff that the apprentice did years ago before they were even on the apprenticeship, and obviously that's not valid. And so you're back to that scenario of when you then have to go back to that employer and ask them to do another witness testimony, and they get annoyed. So why was the apprentice involved? Again, it's just useful for setting the scene. How does it align to their particular job role? Actually, were they doing something proactive? Did they go above and beyond to do that? And then how well do you think the apprentice performed? And again, that links back to that bit about opinion and that quote from the team leader standard. So while the opinion doesn't directly influence the grade, because ultimately the assessor's got to form their own opinion based on the evidence, I think it is useful. If I were an assessor and I were reviewing it, I would want to know not only what the apprentice thinks of their own performance, but also what everybody that they work with thinks about their performance as well. I think it just helps you to kind of make that judgment. Okay, a few more points on good practice. Just include all of the essential details. So the templates that we provide have kind of most, if not all of this in them. As and when we kind of review those, which we'll be doing shortly, we'll make sure that they are really closely aligned to these things. But I'll just quickly run through them and kind of why they're important. Name of the apprentice, obviously important. Date of the witness testimony, so the date that the employer or the witness has actually kind of written the testimony, or if you're going to do it as an audio recording, at the beginning of the recording, record the date that activity is taking place. Again, it's just to ensure that it's kind of current and valid. And the date of the observed activity for the same reason, because if it's going to be something that you observed 2 years ago and they've only been on program for a year, it's not going to be valid. The name of the witness, obvious reasons, the job title of the witness, and their relation to the apprentice, so i.e., e.g., line manager, worked on a project with them, that sort of thing, and the length of the time that you've known them. Now, it's not necessarily essential, but I would say it's definitely good practice to list the learning outcomes in the witness testimony, and then also to reference them on the portfolio referencing table as well. And again, it's just so that you're making it easier for the assessor, really, which isn't just about making it easy just for the sake of it. This is a showcase. The assessor will be looking at kind of dozens, if not hundreds of these. So it's your responsibility as a coach really to try and present that apprentice's work in the best possible light. Put yourself in the mindset of an assessor who's just kind of reviewed dozens and dozens of them. How's this one going to stand out? And one of the ways that you can do that is to really make it that showcase. So it's only got the best bits of work and it's really high impact. It's really clearly presented and well mapped. The apprentice starts on the right foot in there, and the assessor then can be really focused on, okay, ticking off, okay, outcomes. And then the assessor will look at it again, they'll listen to the recording again, and on that second listening, that's when they start to apply the holistic assessment, and that's when they start to kind of pick up on the extra bit that might not be mapped. So by doing that mapping and helping the assessor, you're ultimately helping the apprentice. Okay, and last couple of bits on good practice. I think it's really important for the line manager and or the coach to review the statement or review the recording afterwards, because while you might have kind of positioned it with the line manager, okay, all right, we're going to be recording a witness statement about this reflective statement that the apprentices wrote, give them an opportunity to read through it, right, we're going to give you kind of 15-20 minutes to give your account of what happened and your view on it, with all of that steer of the the whys, the what's, the whys, focusing on these particular learning outcomes. But then actually what you'll probably find is that if you review the written statement or you review the recording afterwards, you usually will find that there are additional learning outcomes that are met that weren't necessarily targeted and weren't necessarily mapped back into the referencing table. So it's applying that holistic assessment after the event. Now, our assessor will do that anyway. We're absolutely clear with the assessors that they should do that. But if you kind of do it proactively before it's submitted, it just gives that extra chance that those extra bits are going to be picked up and awarded. And the other reason to kind of review it afterwards is to also look at other learning outcomes or other bits of evidence in the portfolio that witness testimony might serve to validate. So the employer might start talking about something else, and you might think, oh, actually that connects to this other reflective statement, or oh, there's a behaviour in there. Let's have a look at that list of behaviours and link it back. So, like I say, the assessor will do that anyway as part of the EPA process. But if you can do it as well and encourage the employer to have that mindset, if everybody's kind of doing their bit, the apprentice is going to come away with a better experience and a better result, frankly. Mentioned this a couple of times. Now, there's nothing to say that you have to do this. So a witness testimony, witness statement can just be focused on kind of, an activity or a particular group of learning outcomes. But time and time again, the feedback, I'm always going out to our assessors and our IQAs and saying, okay, what are the good examples of witness testimonies? What are the good examples of reflective statements? And without exception, the best examples are always where the witness testimony is actually aligned to a reflective statement, because it just makes it much more focused, much clearer for the witness as to kind of what they're supposed to be talking about. It's already in a way pre-mapped to the learning outcomes because the reflective statement has been. So it's validating those specific outcomes, which is what you've sort of set out to want to achieve. And it just makes it much neater, I think, rather than kind of having disparate bits of evidence that don't really form a very clear picture. It always seems to work better if you've got witness testimonies that relate directly to and describe a reflective statement. And the other thing it does is it also very clearly gives that kind of additional perspective for the assessor. So the assessor knows nothing about the apprentice. They don't know anything about kind of how good they are, how they approach their work. They'll get a feel for that from the reflective statement, but ultimately that's a subjective account from the apprentice. If there's a witness testimony that aligns directly to that reflective statement, they're almost looking at it with another pair of eyes, which really helps them with that process. And I think that helping the witness to understand the purpose, again, is really important. So in advance of it, okay, you're going to be doing a witness testimony. It's going to form part of the portfolio for the endpoint assessment. We're wanting to focus on these specific learning outcomes. So here's a copy of them in advance so you can read through. And I think understanding those learning outcomes is really important. For example, there might be kind of a range in there. So if the apprentice has to demonstrate that they've used a range of media in their reflective statement, they might have only talked about using emails. If you or the line manager picks up on that, then what the line manager can do is say, yeah, I've seen them use the emails, but actually I've also seen them do it as a phone call. I've seen them do it as face-to-face. So again, it's going beyond just validating what the apprentice has said, and it's actually adding to it and adding value. And last but not least, just ensuring that the mapping is sufficiently detailed. Now, we don't want to kind of, there's a balance to be struck, I think, with the mapping, and we certainly don't want to be kind of unreasonable. But again, it just goes back to that. The more you can kind of showcase it as a really neat, concise, well put together portfolio, the better the impression the assessor's going to get of the apprentice. Conscious, Chelsea, I've just talked for a long time. Are there any kind of more questions that we want to answer so we can hear your voice for a little while?
Yeah, so there's one that's, is there a recommended time frame for an audio witness testimony?
Yeah, really good question. There isn't. It really depends on what, again, it's the purpose of it. So is if it's aligning to a reflective statement, it's going to depend on how big that reflective statement is, how many learning outcomes it's seeking to achieve. But one of the principles that we've kind of put in place recently, and we'll be adding this to the toolkits, is that where it comes to audio, for any standard up to and including level 5, we don't expect to see more than 2 hours in total of audio. And really, I don't think it's necessary to have more than 2 if it's done kind of with all of these principles in mind that we've looked at, and it's very focused and the person's been briefed. 2 hours, it should be plenty. What I will say is that I think short and more concise audio recordings are always more effective, and I have got a bit on that at the end when I'm going to talk specifically about audio. But we wouldn't say that there's a recommended duration, but from my own experience, when I've kind of assessed an IQA, if there's more than half an hour in a single recording, assessors are only human. You get a bit bored, you switch off a little bit. So having it concise, it helps keep the witness on track, but it also, helps to make sure that the the portfolio is kind of appealing and is manageable and is actually enjoyable listening to it. If it becomes kind of 45 minutes, an hour long per recording, it can become a bit tedious, and if it's not effectively mapped, there's a massive risk that there's evidence in there that gets missed.
Okay. So the next question is from Julie. Have we got approval to EPA the HR level 3 and level 5 on the learning and development pathway? Now I think I know the answer to this one. It's the specialisms that you can do with the HR standards, which we do EPA all of the specialisms, don't we?
We do, yeah. So we're approved for both of those standards and all of the specialisms, yeah.
Great.
Yeah, you can pick up with Chelsea if you're interested in learning more about that.
Okay, great. So the next one is, can the learner have input with their line manager when completing the witness testimony?
That's also a really good question. And I know that this has happened as a kind of COVID dispensation. I can't see why not, really, thinking off the top of my head, because I know that with some training providers, I've had conversations with them and we've approved this as an approach where they've had that real difficulty getting the product evidence. Everybody's working from home, they're all over the country. And so they've had almost a tripartite conversation between the learner, the coach and the line manager. And it's actually been kind of really effective. So I can't think of a reason why not, to be honest. So the answer is that's fine, unless somebody comes up with a reason why we can't do it, in which case we'll communicate that to everybody.
Yeah, and Sue's asked, how many examples does the witness have to give? And she's put, in another awarding body, there's 3 examples with an extension on 2 of them.
Okay, well, we don't specify. The only reason we would be if there were a requirement in a particular assessment plan. But to my knowledge, the ones that we assess, there is no such requirement. So you can submit a portfolio with no witness testimonies in it. It's fine. You can submit a portfolio with 10 witness testimonies in it. It's fine. So we definitely don't put a number on it. I guess it's just those principles apply of making sure that they're not kind of overly long and that they're focused, and that you don't overly rely on them, because there needs to be product evidence and things like that as well to validate what's in there. What we can't do is just have a portfolio that's made up entirely of reflective statements and witness testimonies. We have asked that question of the Institute for Apprenticeships at the beginning of the COVID crisis, and even under the COVID kind of dispensations, they said that wasn't allowed. So the expectation very much is that you need to have product evidence in there. One thing that we've noticed with the newer assessment plan, so the new team leader, for example, is although that's a non-assessed portfolio, it's a lot more specific in the assessment plan as to what the requirements are for the portfolio. So it is very clear that there's a blend of evidence is required. It specifies, I think, 20 pieces of evidence as a minimum. So that's another reason, really, actually, to break down the witness testimonies, because if you're required to have 20 bits of evidence, you've got 15 really good bits of product evidence that meet all the learning outcomes. Frankly, you've arbitrarily got to get another 5. Well, 5 small witness testimonies gets you to the 20, whereas 1 big one doesn't. One other thing that I'll mention just now while we're on the topic is around reflective statements, actually. And you may or may not have noticed in the newer assessment plans, and the team leader is another great example of this, there's a statement in there that expressly forbids the use of reflective accounts within portfolios, and it says they can't be included. And that comes from the position, really, that that's the apprentice's subjective account of their own performance, and therefore it can't be assessed. But then within the same assessment plan, so team leader, for example, it will say that actually the portfolio of evidence needs to include written statements. So I think that the mismatch here is between what's meant by a reflective statement, because actually at DSW when we talk about reflective statements, what we really mean is it's that written account that provides the context. So it'll be, okay, I dealt with this complaint. These are the steps that I took, ... These are the bits of evidence that map into it. These are the learning outcomes that map into it. That is actually fine. I think what the Institute doesn't want is for the apprentice to do a sort of self-appraisal and mark themselves against the learning outcome, because obviously that's subjective. So I think there's a bit of work for us to do as an organisation, and probably the wider sector, actually, around terminology and naming conventions and so what we're going to call. So really what it is more of a personal statement rather than a reflective statement. It doesn't necessarily require any reflection. And certainly what the Institute says that can't be assessed anyway, that reflection element of it. I will just crack on a few more slides, and then I'm happy to stay on as long as is needed for any additional questions. We've got 10 more minutes anyway, so we'll just continue. So the common mistakes, and again, these are based on kind of themes and things that assessors tell us that they frequently see in portfolios, which if avoided, will make for a better portfolio, basically. So lack of specificity, again, said it a million times, but try not as an employer or a witness to talk in general terms. Outside the acceptable period, so the activity either took place before the apprenticeship or it didn't take place within the period that's defined within the assessment plan as being acceptable. So if the assessment plan, for example, says, okay, you can use evidence up to 3 months before gateway, there's a witness testimony in there about something that happened 6 months before gateway, straight away it's an invalid piece of evidence. Focusing on opinions rather than facts is common mistake. And again, I do think opinions are important, but they shouldn't form the focus and the basis of it. Now, this is an interesting one. So it's not necessary. So if you've got a written, there's a big difference actually. If you've got a written witness testimony, usually it's kind of it's just sort of emailed to the employer line manager, and they'll just fill it in. In many ways, the recorded ones are actually more effective because they're almost led like a professional discussion between the coach and the line manager or whoever the witness is. Now that has its benefits, but it also has its drawbacks. So I think one of the common mistakes or one of the common kind of pitfalls with that approach is the coach kind of pressing the button and then letting the witness talk. And what happens is the witness often, if they're not given a really clear steer and questions throughout, they'll go off on one and they'll start waffling, and that's when you end up with these witness testimonies that are an hour long, whereas actually there's probably only 10 minutes of it that's pertinent, and the risk is that pertinent 10 minutes gets lost amongst the rest of it. Conversely, steering too much can be just as bad. So you can't lead the witness. So if you're almost saying, okay, did you observe X, Y, and Z, and saying it in real detail and then getting a kind of binary yes or no answer, you've invalidated that straight away. It might be that the apprentice did all that stuff, but because you've put the words in that person's mouth and they've just said yes, we can't really accept that as a valid piece of evidence. Too long, too short. How long's a piece of string? But I guess some of those principles that were described before around, if it's an audio recording, to me, anywhere between sort of 10 minutes to 25 minutes seems about right. Longer than that, and they always feel like they're a little bit too long. Better to have recordings in shorter, concise ones. Written ones, again, difficult to kind of determine what's too short, but sometimes you'll have a paragraph. I mean, what's the value in that? It might hit one learning outcome. Sometimes it'll be 10 pages long, and again, is that really focused on a particular activity? So recorded ones, I'd say between 10 to 20 minutes optimum. Written ones, probably a couple of pages, 3 pages optimum, really, if it's done effectively. Failure to address the specific learning outcomes, and also failure to kind of map in the outcomes or to not do that effectively. Some of those essential details are missing. So if the date's not in there of the observed activity, it's not a valid piece because you can't confirm that it was done within the acceptable period. So really small things like that are actually, they might seem minor, but it can be make or break as to whether or not that can be accepted as a form of evidence. GDPR breaches. So tend not to see these so much with witness statements, because obviously I think line managers are generally kind of alert to these sort of things. We see them all the time in other forms of evidence. So bits of product evidence are not redacted, reflective statements are not redacted, and it can lead to a fail, particularly when we're working in financial services and there's really, really sensitive data in there. So you just have to be really careful. But I think, like I say, it's not usually that big a problem with witness statements because they're usually done by managers who are quite sensitive to that sort of thing. Well, this is an odd one. So this comes up sometimes where the witness might actually declare in the witness statement that the apprentice isn't competent. So we have seen that. We've seen that in panel interviews and things as well, where the line manager is present on the interview and then they say, oh no, they're rubbish at that, actually. Well, straight away the apprentice has failed, because how can the assessor declare that that person's competent when their own line managers just said that they're not? So again, prepping the line manager and making them aware of what the purpose of this activity is really important. And this is a really common one as well, which is being used to plug gaps. So a witness statement, a witness testimony can be a really, really powerful, useful, effective tool if used as part of a blended portfolio. What we do often see is that they are used to plug gaps, and there are sometimes some telltale signs, to be honest, which the assessors will kind of come and tell us. They'll get a portfolio and might have a load of really good stuff in, but then there's one or two kind of hour-long recorded witness testimonies that were done the day before it was submitted that are mapped to sort of half the learning outcomes. So I think it's really important to use the witness testimony kind of wisely and effectively, really, that being that part of the more broader, holistic, blended portfolio, really complementing the reflective statements and the other bits of evidence that are in there, but not kind of just using it because, oh God, we've done the mapping just before we submit it and there's 10 outcomes that we haven't met or haven't validated. So I guess kind of building it in and as part of the process from the beginning is really, really important. Okay, so last bit then before we summarise. I mentioned we're seeing more and more audio recordings. We'd actually started to see more of them towards the end of last year, but certainly, as you'd expect, since COVID struck, we're seeing them all the time. They can be more effective. I think I mentioned that before, because actually you sit down with an assessor, and if it's really well facilitated and steered and controlled by the coach, you'll often get more out of the manager because they can speak more kind of fluidly, and it's more organic and it's more natural. It's a better use of their time because you can cover off a bunch of learning outcomes in a 20-minute conversation, which otherwise you might be waiting weeks and weeks for them to get back with a written reflective statement, which they then send to you and you say, oh God, it's actually no good. Can you do it again? So I think with witness statements in particular, the audio recordings, when they're done well, they're really good, they're really effective. But the same general principles that we've looked at all apply, but I think in particular, there are a few things that are picked out to be kind of particularly conscious of if you're using audio recordings. So the risk of the witness going off topic is kind of exponentially larger because they're getting enthusiastic, talking about this apprentice either, they really love and they've been supporting and they want to see them do well, and they'll start getting emotional and they'll start forming opinions, and they'll start talking about things, other things that we're not actually looking to assess. So again, I think the role of the coach in prepping them and then also facilitating that conversation is critical. Being careful not to lead the witness, so don't go too far in terms of saying, oh yes, I saw that Johnny did this and he did this really well and it made this outcome, and do you agree? Yes. That's no good. Being mindful of GDPR. So I think with a written reflective statement, if by chance there is something that sneaks its way into there and you identify it or your IQA identifies it, with a written document, it's a lot more easy to redact that because you can just cover it up, PDF it, it's gone. With an audio recording, that can be more difficult because obviously you've got to somehow try and beep it out or edit the recording so that it's no longer in there. And then just the final thing on there is really, again, keep it short and snappy and make sure that the witness is really focused on the learning outcomes and really focused on what it is supposed to be doing. It actually reduces the need for timestamping. If you've got an hour-long recorded statement, you're going to have to timestamp it because otherwise it's virtually impossible to assess. If you've got a 10-minute one and you're saying it meets 4 or 5 outcomes, you probably don't really need to, because we appreciate that it is done holistically. It's not a case necessarily that they're saying, okay, learning outcome 1 description, learning outcome 2 description. They're talking about actual activities and things that the apprentice has done. So I think if you've got a shorter sort of 10-minute long witness testimony, it just needs very, very high level mapping rather than that granular kind of timestamping that you would need in a longer one. And lastly, more engaging for the assessor. They are human. They are doing a lot of these assessments. You know, we owe it to the apprentices to make their portfolio stand out, really. So a summary then, I mean, we've got, well, we've run out of time actually, but like I say, I'm more than happy. We're on 10:59 now, but I'm more than happy to stay on and answer any questions. And even if you have to drop off, this has been recorded, so the additional questions will be on the recording. But just to summarize, specificity is king, it is key. Make sure that it's focused. Preparing the witness, making sure they understand the purpose of the activity, putting them into that mindset of the assessor that they don't know the apprentice, so the specificity is necessary in order to provide the context. The mapping is really important, making sure that it's part of a blend and you're not just relying on a witness testimony because it's easy or because you've got some gaps to plug. And then critically analysing, so through your own analysis really and through your own IQA process, is looking at the witness testimonies that you're getting in. Okay, well, where are the good ones? Where are the problems? Where are the trends? How do we emulate that good practice and make that become the standard? And that was it. So I'm sure, Chelsea, we've got kind of a bunch more questions that come through if you want to run through them.
Yeah, so Sandra asked for level 5 ODM. It can be difficult to gain witness testimonies from the line manager. Is it possible to use the template to create questions for the person giving the testimony to complete themselves?
Yes, yeah. So obviously that wouldn't be in our generic templates, but I guess what we want to avoid is a checklist, really. So we don't want to say, okay, here's a list of the learning outcomes, just tick them off, because what will happen is you'll get people that will just tick them. We really, for the witness testimony to have value and to be valid, we need some form of a narrative to have confidence that that person is describing the competence against the outcomes. But if you wanted to present them with some kind of framed questions, absolutely. And that's not too dissimilar really to the approach that tends to be taken with the recorded ones, where, as I say, it's almost done like a professional discussion in terms of, okay, the apprentice has written about this complaint they dealt with. Can you tell me about how they liaised with the customer? Can you tell me about the systems that they used? Did they use them effectively? Okay, were there any internal processes, any external regulations that they had to be aware of? Can you describe those to me? Did they use them effectively? Is there anything they could have or should have done differently? So absolutely, you can pose questions, and I think that steer is really important to keep them on track.
Okay, so the next question is, am I correct in thinking that 20 pieces of evidence is a maximum for team leader supervisor, not an exact?
I can't remember off the top of my head, but I'm going to stop sharing so I can look at my desktop, because I've actually got that standard open and I can check.
Okay.
Any others?
Yeah, so somebody's also asked how many pieces of evidence for business admin and team leader?
Again, we wouldn't specify, and then the current version of team leader, so the new version of team leader won't actually, nobody will be assessed under that for at least a year, but under the current version we don't specify, and the reason we don't is, I mean, it's a balancing act really, because I would love to give a number, but actually it really does depend on the nature of the apprentice's job role, the type of evidence that they're producing naturally, the depth and breadth of their reflective statements and witness statements and things like that. But I would say 20 is not a bad benchmark, to be honest. We'll sometimes get one in with 5 bits, and you know straight away it's not going to be sufficient because there's not going to be enough anywhere near enough product evidence in there. We'll get some that have got hundreds of pieces in, and it's not accessible. I mean, really, it goes back to that showcase element, and actually it needs to be accessible by the assessor within a reasonable period of time. So 20 feels about right, really, for most standards up to kind of level 3, level 4.
Okay, thanks, Jake. We've got a couple of questions here around GDPR. So somebody's asked, would somebody fail if they didn't redact something that the assessor deemed to breach GDPR, even if it helped support their portfolio? And then somebody else has kind of added to that and said, would just mentioning a client's name be a breach of GDPR, even if further details were not mentioned?
Okay, so if I answer the first one first, so to be honest, generally speaking, unless it's a serious breach of GDPR, up until now we haven't failed portfolios, but it is something that we are kind of looking to do, particularly if it's in a heavily regulated sector like financial services. And number one is because that seems the right thing to do, to be honest. But number two is also because there will invariably be in a heavily regulated industry or occupation a learning outcome or a KSB that's in there, which is around protecting people's data. So but you could have a brilliant portfolio that says, yeah, do that, and the line manager says it does. But if you've then submitted a bunch of work with GDPR breaches in it, you've demonstrated that that's not actually the case. So you would fail on that basis. So the other thing is there's a difference as well, though, between GDPR and commercially sensitive stuff, and there's a real disparity between employers actually as to their tolerance for commercially sensitive information within portfolios. So some will say absolutely nothing can go in, and we have real challenges with them actually in terms of validating the evidence. Some are quite laissez-faire and will let quite a lot of stuff in there and don't seem to be too perturbed by it. Obviously, we have measures in place as an EPA to handle information kind of safely and securely, and in line with GDPR and regulatory requirements, but we wouldn't fail it then necessarily based on if it's just commercially sensitive, because we might be failing it when actually the employer's not actually bothered about that. We probably would feed it back in the evidence, but if it's a GDPR breach, then I mean, yeah, it's something that we're looking at much more closely, because obviously there are responsibilities for organisations. If you identify a GDPR breach in certain circumstances, you also have to report it as well. So rather than use a stick, I think we'd want to use a carrot and be much clearer as to our guidance to prevent it from happening in the first place. And the second question, getting into the technicalities of GDPR, which I'm not an expert on by any means, but I believe that you need two identifiable factors within the communication for a person. So if you had their name and their phone number, for example, that would be considered kind of a breach. But if it was just their name, then I don't believe it would.
Great, thanks, Jake. That's it for the questions. You've got a couple of nice notes from people thanking you, but that's it for the questions.
Excellent, thank you very much. I'm just trying to find this bit about the 20 pieces of evidence, and I can't actually find it anymore. Give me 1 second. Yeah, it says it will typically have 20 pieces of evidence. So, I mean, that's suitably vague that you could get away with 10 or 30, really. Not that helpful. Fab. Well, if you don't have any more questions, I'd just like to say thanks again for your time. Really appreciate it. I know everybody's busy. The recording will be going up on YouTube shortly, so do feel free to kind of share with your colleagues. And we look forward to hosting the next one as well. And have a great day, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.